We are live.
Okay, we're great. All right, we're experiencing a little technical difficulties on the back end here, but welcome everybody to another fabulous episode of Franklin Outside. I, of course, am your host, Dr. Rachel Valletta, environmental scientist with the Franklin Institute. Today, I have on a very special colleague, and I am lucky to say friend, newly minted Dr. Asia Carter, coming at us from the University of Pennsylvania today. Dr. Carter, thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Yeah. Again, yes, again. So Asia and I, now Asia, when I first met you, of course, you have been trained as a paleontologist, but as we see in today's event title, we're talking about robotics edition of Franklin Outside, which is, usually outside of the norm of where we go in this program. Of course, we're talking about the earth and environmental sciences, but I was really excited to have you on this program in this particular month for a few different reasons. So of course, in the broad context of things, we're celebrating Women's History Month. And what I find so fascinating about you as a person and your science is that you sort of really, you represent this amalgamation, I think, of past, present, and future, like all wrapped up into one beautiful STEM package. And I'm really excited to explore that today with you. So I guess first off, tell us, so you're trained as a paleontologist originally, but now you're based at the GRASP lab at Penn. So maybe first help us understand, what's the GRASP lab all about and what the heck is a paleontologist doing there?
So what is the GRASP lab all about? What a great question. I'm still learning because I started in July. So GRASP lab is sort of the robotics at Penn. There are tons of different labs there. There's mod lab, modular lab. There's the lab that I'm in, COD lab, which is all about legged robots, which is how I got in. I'm really interested in legged systems. And I didn't know this until very recently, but they've been doing the robotics game since like the 70s. I didn't know there was a robotics game in the 70s. So yeah, and it's I'm still really new, so I'm still really doe-eyed about it. It's sci-fi. It's total, like, I just saw a robot crossing the street and I wasn't expecting that today. And there goes my coffee because it just jumped a little bit. It's total sci-fi. I'm still getting used to this joke that I have for myself is, oh my God, it's something to the effect of like, there's a party and I'm always 10 minutes late because they're like, oh yes, look at this new system. And I'm like, that thing has legs. Or we're not gonna talk about the legs.
So the GRASP lab, of course, good friend of the Franklin Institute. So we're always excited to have them on. But as mentioned, you're a paleontologist,
yes.
And you're sort of working in this weird space that's like marrying paleontology and robotics. So first off, like before we even talk about the human connections of that, help us understand this field that you're like really spearheading, which I think is so fascinating. And you've called it Paleobioinspired robots, right? Do I have that mouthful correct?
Yes.
Okay, so tell us what that's all about.
So the particular lab that I'm in is really interested in bioinspired robotics, right? So there's biomimetic robots, which are like the copy-paste robots. You see a really cool critter, you recreate the critter, and you've got your biomimetic. Bioinspired is, let's take something about the underlying mechanism of this robot or this animal and get into one of our systems, right? Like, how do animals walk through the world? What are the physical underlying mechanisms of that? Let's get that into a robot and see if it helps us, if we learn something about the animals themselves. So that's bioinspired. I'm a paleontologist, so all of my biology has been extinct for a really long time. And I'm like an old paleontologist, not a dinosaur one that's like hip and new, to me anyway. So for me, it's taking that idea and stretching it back about 360 million years, right? Is, okay, so we understand how this animal sort of moves. And when this animal moves, it's a consequence of its evolutionary history, of the bone geometry, of the muscles that attach, the controls, the way the neural anatomy works, which I do not talk and think about because I'm a paleontologist. There's some that do, I don't. So I say, okay, you have a behavior. We know this behavior is repeatable, it's testable, it's in these robotic systems. When does that behavior show up in the fossil record? How can we interpret behavior in the fossil record? And is there something in the fossil record that can in turn inform the behavior of these robots? So I'm just dragging a lot of biologists and engineers kicking and screaming back into the fossil record with me.
So give us an example. You mentioned, so that modern bio-inspired robot. What's an example of one that you find particularly exciting?
So the lab that the lab that I'm in, they have these really big, I think they look like dogs. I don't know the technical term for them, but they look like dogs and they're like knee height. And I just see them walking around sometimes. I think it's part of Ghost Robotics, which was a subsidiary out of my lab, or the lab that I'm in now. And man, you know what robot gets me really excited? Oh man, there was a student who defended his thesis, I think a year ago now, Dr. Jeffrey Dupreet, and he has a robot with a spine in it. It's called Canid. So there you go, an actual dog. Canid and Inu, I think, are the two. And they have, that's really what got me interested in this particular lab, is there are a lot of robots that kind of look the same, but this lab had robots with spines. And I'm like, what kind of spines? Can we change the spines? Can we change the geometry of the parts of the spine and learn something about behavior? So Canid and Inu are probably my two favorites.
Okay, so a modern bio-inspired robot might be inspired by a dog, for example.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Cheetahs.
or cheetahs, for example, right? But you're pushing this idea deep, deep, deep into the past. You said hundreds of millions of years ago. You're looking at these paleontological specimens to inform how we build new types of robots, right, that have new movements. What are some examples of paleontological samples? So you're looking to natural remains, right, in Earth's past to inform that. What kind of critters are we thinking about from the past?
So my favorite group of critters is called temnospondyls, right? And the reason I love them is because they're complicated and nobody wants to work with them. So when you think of Canid and Inu, cheetahs, T-Rexes, snakes, giraffes, whales, almost anything that you can think of today, and pretty recently, about 100 million years ago, that have a spine, they have a particular brand of spine, right? Of vertebra. The animals that I'm interested in totally twisted that on its head, right? So if you can imagine a vertebra in your mind right now, it kind of looks like a hockey puck and has a little part sticking off of it, right? But it's all one part. The vertebrae that I work on and in my group of animals have these multi-part type vertebrae. So imagine you sort of have like a crescent, right? Like a croissant. And then you have these two bones that sort of look like wrist bones. And you have another part that's floating up here. And they're not fused. I don't know how much movement was between them, but they're not fused. And that's an important point. They're not fused and they were ubiquitous for years. So this like hot new brand of vert that we see in almost everything today came around, 100 million years, but for 200 million years, right? 200 million years, a huge chunk of our evolutionary history, right? Like our ancestors, they had this vertebral morphology that was in all parts bizarre and complicated. And what's difficult is it's only recently we've got the technology to start thinking about how these might rotate relative to each other. And it's like, okay, I've got this one vert that's doing this thing next to this one. And what about out here and out here and out here? So the reason I love Canid and Inu and my taxa and getting some of my really complex vertebrae in there to say, okay, in paleontology, right, we tend to find, one bone or a few bones, right? It's like, okay, I have 2 bones here and I can estimate some range of motion here. Can I estimate out here? Can I estimate out here? And if I have enough bones, can I estimate some global range of motion for the taxa? I've loved dinosaurs since I was 5. I just happen to be now like a 5'7" 5-year-old, right? And I love imagining my taxa alive, right? Just imagining them walking, and in my case, like doing a little bit of a wiggle. That's what I love thinking about, and getting to work with roboticists, like it's coming out of my imagination real soon. And that's super exciting.
Definitely. Oh, I love that energy, Asia. So remember, you folks, if you're just joining in from home, you can shoot us some questions in the chat. We have on a paleontologist turned roboticist today. And so again, we're pushing the limits of our typical programming here, but we're pulling in Earth's past to help us understand something about the present and maybe about the future. And that's my next question for you, Asia. What's the big so what here? So it's cool to think about recreating how dinos moved and how these prehistoric creatures moved. But how does that apply to humans today? What's the big so what?
Yeah, so as far as I can tell, and a lot of people have also told me, robots are coming into our lives. Like they just are, you know. They're being deployed a lot more rapidly. They're going to become not just these magical things that I get to see down the street, but things that are in our lives. And we want them to have robust locomotion, right? We don't want them to hit water and slip if they're carrying something for us, or if they're in these nursing homes and helping elderly people, right? We want robust systems. Nature is really good at getting rid of things that don't work, right? So it's not to say everything here is perfect. Everything is good for the situation it's in right now, but that is the beauty of paleontology, right? Every experiment that is ever going to be run in terms of locomotion and complex locomotion, robust locomotion, every experiment that there is to be run has been run so far, right? That is the lab book of Mother Nature. And as a paleontologist, I get to read her notes, and maybe your lab book was a little bit better, but like my notebook, right? Their notes are messy. There are parts missing. Some of it's nonsensical and won't make sense for a little bit longer, but that is what paleontology gives us, is answers to questions we might not have even asked yet, right? So we have these bioinspired systems, right? You look at a cheetah and you say, I want to build a cheetah robot because it's crazy fast, right? That cheetah is very specialized, right? That cheetah might not, if your question is, I want to build a fast thing, cheetahs are the fastest things we have now, right? Were they always the fastest, right? Let's say you're thinking about, I want to build a huge gliding robot, and you build something like a condor, right? Where are condors the biggest things that have ever flown? No, right? There's giant pterosaurs that glided, right? There were even bigger birds back in like the Pleistocene-ish. I check out after the Mesozoic.
Right, you're a real deep time scientist.
Yeah.
For folks at home, you should know this is a rift between Asia and I. I like more recent history. Asia likes to look deeper in time.
Yeah,
it's two in the shadows for me there.
So that's that's the so what of paleontology, right? In these robotic systems,
right.
Is ask the question, right? Your answer might not be here in time. That does not mean it was not here before. And a paleontologist, we know how to read the bones, the depositional environments. We know how to read this notebook, and sometimes say that it's incomplete.
Right. It seems, at the superficial level, this idea of paleontology and robotics together seems so disparate and unusual. But when you put it that way, which by the way was a really, really beautifully stated narrative, it seems such a natural fit together. Of course, to learn from, as you said, Mother Nature's lab notebook, which of course is much, much thicker than any that we will ever have.
Yeah, I'm good with reading, like, there's a slice. She has like a slice in the back. I'm like, yes, this is my thing. And the second you go 2 pages over, I'm like, I don't know what I'm looking at. And I refuse to look anymore.
All righty. So we have a question from Athena. And of course, we know we have paleontologists on, so we have to ask the question, what is your favorite dinosaur? And will you be making a robotic version of it?
Oh, man. Okay, so my favorite dinosaur. All right, I have two. The first one I have to say, because it was like my first application, is Dreadnought Austrani. It's this big honking sauropod. But my favorite one, my favorite in my heart of hearts, is a Therizinosaur. So I want you to imagine for a moment, this like T-Rex sized dinosaur with a pot belly, with claws like, that freaking long, with teeth that sort of look like our molars, because they're really flat, and a beak. It's like, what are you doing? And no, I probably won't make a robot out of that dinosaur, because I don't, nah. but I
world
do.
Doesn't need that.
The world doesn't need that, but I do love it. It's just like, see, sometimes Mother Nature gets bored and starts doodling in the sides. You're just like, what?
So I have a question. So if Mother Nature is so good at ruling out, making new designs and ruling out these old designs, why is it that we don't see, for you? So you were talking about these these vertebrae from this specimen 390 million years ago. That critter's not around anymore. So can we possibly believe that it had optimized any one behavior? Right? Like, wouldn't it still be around if it had optimized some sort of life behavior?
So when we talk about optimization is time and place, right? So my taxa were amphibious, and you know what? When the world was mostly a rainforest, that was great. And sometime near the Permian, there's this huge aridification. The world becomes a desert, right? So all of a sudden, these perfect amphibians are not perfect because they're in a desert, right? Does that mean they were any less optimized for their time and place? No, their time and place, actually, because continents shift over long geologic timescales, right? Both of those changed, right? And then there are some things that we just keep around for a really long time. And the thing with evolution is it's not necessarily optimized, it's more it doesn't kill you, right? So 5 fingers and 5 toes, right? We have had this trait for a long time. And if it was terrible, right, we'd get rid of it. And sometimes we do, right? Think of your dinosaurs that have like the 3 toes, right? So there's this entire study of, well, this works for most things. Why did dinosaurs change to this? And for us, walking flat, right? Like this works for most things. Why do some things like your dogs walk on their tippy toes? Why did horses switch to walking on their middle fingers? Excuse me. Why do, so it's optimization for time and place, right? So cheetahs, right? Savanna grasslands, they're probably really good there. But if you put them in, let's say, a forest situation, does that change, right? Which is also a question we can ask with physical models in robotics, right? Is instead of, I guess, inhumanely picking up a cheetah and dropping it in, a tundra, we can just say, well, I have my hypothesis about what makes this cheetah great, what makes this animal great. If I change the parameters of its location, does its greatness change? And more often than not, yes. Like animals are very specialized for what we do, right? Humans, we're great at what we do, and that's why we just take our homes everywhere, right? We don't get better at swimming, we build subs.
Right. Okay, so this brings me actually to a really intriguing toy problem, I think. So on this program, we talk, of course, a lot about the environment and climate in particular. I spend a lot of time talking about. So let's imagine 50, 100, 200 years into the future. We know that climate change is playing out. Depending on how humans behave, it's going to be pretty intense in terms of temperature increase in certain areas, sea level rise. It all of a sudden makes sense now to think about studying those paleontological specimens in the past that are analogous to these potential future scenarios, so that we can inform better robotics for water inundated areas, for higher temperature conditions, for more humid or dry conditions, depending on where you are in the globe. Has anybody thought about that? I mean, that seems like a specialized subtopic of a field that you're sort of pushing outwards on right now.
So there's, in paleontology, there's been some studies that exactly that, like when you have a huge environmental perturbation, what happens, right? Unfortunately, as a paleontologist, I can tell you extinction, right? Mm-hmm. Is you change something drastic in the environment, most things that were suited for that environment are not gone. In terms of robotics, there is increasingly more I guess the word is transitionary robotics, right? So think about you're having a great day at the beach, you put your towel down, you run to the beach, you go for a swim, you come back, right? Like sand is a right nightmare to locomote on and to build systems that can locomote. Oh, and now you're swimming. Oh, where do we, so there's this push for more and it's partially because I'm a city girl, right, from Philadelphia. The robots that I find really interesting that I don't work on too much are city robots. Think about just walking around in Philadelphia when we get to again, right? And there's broken concrete, there's changes in the heights of the concrete, there's grass all of a sudden, and that's a little bit more pliant than concrete. There's, in rescue robot situations, right, there's rubble you can't always see. So I think to your question, I think transitionary robots and climate change might be a place that can kiss. I haven't seen it yet, but I know they exist separate.
Okay, cool. All right, well, we'll have to have you back on in a few years, and we'll touch on that case. All right, so I do have a video queued up here off screen that I'd like to share because I think it helps us understand really, really simplistically, when you say building robots from paleontological specimens, what it is that you're talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen, and Asia, let me know that you can see this. Can you see that there? So there's no audio here, but we're looking at an article that was written about your work on Penn Today's magazine. And this is an actual robot that you developed from a 3D print of a paleontological specimen. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so this is an early prototype that is not, you know what, that's a lesson in science, right? Always improving, right? If you look back on an old experiment, you're like, oh, I don't like that. That's called growth. So this was my attempt at handling really complex 3D vertebrae, right? So I was talking earlier about how these parts all move and change like that. And I was like, well, can I just draw like a circle around all of that convex hull and print that? And then what about the squishy stuff in between? And I'm learning now that squishy stuff in between is complicated.
Mm-hmm.
So in this, it's just sort of a gel, and I'm redesigning this experiment currently with much more complicated techniques, and hopefully will be out in a few months. But this is difficult, and I didn't know this until I joined my lab, but spines are tricky. They're multi-segmented, right, which is already sort of a difficult thing. And then you can see a little motor sticking out there, right? So how you actuate a spine is also really difficult. We have muscles, and muscles are amazing. And engineering doesn't have that sort of actuation yet, right? Yeah. So imagine if you had to have a tiny little motor at each part of your spine. All of a sudden, that robot is really heavy. And, can engineers design a robot that its motors cannot move? Yes. So Mother Nature wouldn't do that, right? Mother Nature has not made a critter that couldn't move. Couldn't move if it had to. There are sessile taxa, yes. They're not supposed to. Sessile
meaning non-moving, of course.
Yeah, of course. Like barnacles, right? They don't move that much because they're not supposed to move. But animals that are supposed to move can move. Mother Nature hasn't, an animal that can't move yet. Engineers can. Right. So if you put this spine and you have no way to actuate because you don't have muscles, you might build something that can't move. It's too heavy.
Yeah. Okay. So this actually is related to a question we received from Benjamin, and there's a fantastic set of questions here. So I'll just go one by one through them. And the very first question is also on my mind, Benjamin. Thank you for asking. From a set of fossilized bones, how do you figure out their locomotion?
Yeah. So I am lucky in that I work. Bittersweet lucky that I work on vertebrae. So limbs, right? If you think of like a shoulder, right? That's a ball and socket. It's this, in a lot of things, it's a ball and socket. You got this 360 degrees. Some of my taxa are like a peanut, right? So the humerus can still swing a little bit. But vertebrae are wonderfully complicated, which means they have hard, bony stops, right? So you can imagine you have two rigid objects that don't go through each other, right? I can push my hands really, really hard together, and they shouldn't smush through each other, right? So you can look at the shape of bones and see how they rotate relative to each other. That's an overestimation, right? Because the second you add in squishy parts like cartilage and muscles, that how far they can move will decrease, but it's a good first estimate. So I did it with vertebrae, and a lot of people do it with limbs, and limbs are really, really complicated, which is why I stay away from them. But it's a similar sort of thing, right? Is you can rearticulate the bones, right? So get them what you think they look like when the animal is alive. And as a preliminary test, just start rotating them relative to each other. Early paleontologists had these bones on jackets, like huge pieces of plaster and wood, and you would need a bunch of people to move them back and forth and be like, oh, I think this is right. But now we have more digital ways of doing it. So Maya, AutoCAD, things like that. And for me, 3D printing, because I also love 3D printing.
Right. And so there are some follow-up questions here. Do you create simulations in a digital environment? It seems like yes, you do. And Benjamin also asked if you use machine learning to figure out how the dinosaur's body might have moved around. Is that an area that you're exploring, or is that sort of down the road a little bit?
Is that a thing I'm going to write down for later? So right now, even the best techniques are still very manual, right? So you have this great system. It's like a marionette, it's like a puppet, right? And you just like.
So you actually try to force some model in all types of directions and just see which way it naturally fits.
Yeah, but I haven't seen any paper that does this with machine learning yet.
Yeah.
Benjamin might want to get
Well, thanks, Benjamin. That might be the next project. You'll have to reach out to Dr. Carter to explore that further together. Okay. So Chris asks, what got you interested in doing this field, right? This is, again, sort of a novel marriage between two rather disparate fields. What got you interested in it? And what are your high-level goals that you're looking to accomplish here?
So what got me interested is, again, this 5-year-old dream of seeing my animals alive. And it sounds imaginative until it isn't, right? So I want to understand how these bones moved in life. And I can start with my digital models, right? But there are some things digital models just can't do, right? Like the physical world has tons of variables that I just can't predict. And even when I have my 3D prints, so like in that video, right, it's just a spine that's just sitting, right? And we can wiggle that back and forth, and we can change the 3D printed parts, we can change the thickness of the squishy parts between them. But that's just a spine. And I said, I want to know how the animal moves. So if I want to understand how the vertebra affect the vertebral column, which affects the entire motion of the animal, I need something a little bit farther than where I was, and that's into robotics, right? Physical modeling, digital modeling, that's in paleontology. But if I want to see a system walk and change a parameter and see how that changes its walking, if at all, robotics. What was the second question? The second part of
I think
question?
you sort of actually wandered into it already. Chris was asking your goals for this work, but it sounds like understanding that ultimate motion is just what's still driving you.
Yeah, it definitely is. So my thesis was all about a single joint. And I understand single joints really, really, really well, but a single joint walking doesn't make, right? I want to see my like 4-meter long salamanders moving. And that's sort of it. I mean, my big goals, right, is to have some understanding of how vertebral geometry affects range of motion for all taxa, right? And mammals are pretty well handled, reptiles a little bit less, and then amphibians, no chance, and then my taxa even less chance. What I want to do is build some rules, right? And the reason I want to do that is because I want accessibility. I have access to robots. I have access to digital models. But if you're a paleontologist out in the field and you come out across a birder, you're a student in a less well-funded lab, I want you still to have some understanding of the fossil that you're holding. So on top of robots, I also want to get some governing mechanisms, some measurements maybe a person could take that anybody that picks up a bird will say, oh, okay, I know something about this animal.
So you're pushing out into this great beyond, this unknown area.
Yeah.
I would imagine that comes along with a lot of challenges. You're sort of having to are you having to make up like methods as you go here?
Yeah. Yeah. So
Is that a thorny question?
No. So that's something that I'm coming to learn as an experimentalist, right? Is like sometimes you have to design an experiment to understand a part of experiment before you can do the first experiment. And a lot of my methods are just, we're gonna find out. I am not afraid to be wrong, right? If you run an experiment, you try a model, you learn something, right? You learn your parameters are bad, you learn the model doesn't do what you want it to do, but you always learn something. So I'm not afraid to be wrong. So a lot of it is developing techniques and be like, okay, this isn't gonna work, or this is totally gonna work, or let's take a part here and a part there. That phase was the second chapter of my thesis, was developing a method to answer the first question of my thesis. That's what this was.
Right. For all our budding scientists out there, it is a slog getting through the training, but once you do, you get to go in really fantastic, interesting new directions. So
yeah. I make a face, but I love what I do.
Well, there's good and bad with all, of course. So we do have a fabulous question from Hirsch, and it kind of mimics a little bit what we just answered, but maybe we can spin it a different way. And Hirsch asks, what's the hardest part of marrying, paleontology and engineering together?
Speaking different languages. So it's down to really small things. So like my lab, like I said earlier at Kane and EU, they have robots with spines in them, right? And they have a very specific definition of what. Oh, they're so excited.
There we go. We have some fans in this house. I'll mute myself. Go ahead.
So what my lab considers a spine, what roboticists consider a spine, right? It's very different from what I consider a spine, right? When I talk about, oh, I want to understand the motion, I always think of terms of kinematics, which is just how are these elements moving relative to each other. But like modern biologists who work with robotics a lot more, sometimes think about energetics, right? So it's like how much energy, where is it coming from? What is the musculature, right? So something that I'm still working on is learning to say what I mean and to understand what they're saying and what they actually mean. So like there's a robot from Boston Dynamics, Atlas, maybe. If you saw the video of them dancing, it was sort of the big one that looks like a person. He has this little joint down at his body, towards his hip that helps like his limbs rotate. And so my lab was like, oh, that's a spine. And then you have this moment where you're like, does one vert a spine make? I don't think so. So the difficulty is getting us to speak the same language. The interesting part of that is it makes me question my assumptions, right? So turtles have a spine in their shells, right? Phylogenetically, and technically they have one, but they don't use it to walk. So do they have a kinematic spine? Do they have a spine? Do you know what I mean? Having to translate makes me understand my language deeper.
Yeah. Oh, I love that answer, Asia. And it's of course a challenge that we're all met with on the day-to-day, right? Just sort of trying to figure out how to speak one another's languages and understanding where the scientists that we're working with are at.
Yeah.
It's a great challenge and a great skill, of course, to develop. And I love that second bit there about questioning your own assumptions through that process, right? Which if you weren't sort of breaking out of this paleontology role, you wouldn't necessarily be doing. So it's cool to see that interdisciplinary, these two fields sort of informing one another. Okay, so we have a rather specific question from Chris. And Chris asks, does the familial relationship between dinosaurs and birds have implications for the work of understanding or modeling dinosaur movement? Meaning, since birds can be observed in motion.
Yeah, so a lot of mechanical studies looking at dinosaurs use bird inputs, right? So there's John Hutchinson might be a person you want to do some Googling. They look at how could T-Rex run, right? The real question, I saw Jurassic Park, it's probably I'm a paleontologist, could T-Rex chase down my Jeep, right? So what you can do is look at, something like an ostrich, right? Or a rhea, which are pretty big birds, big to us now, and as big as they've ever been. And you can say, well, okay, here's the limb of a rhea, and here's the limb of a T-Rex. What's the scale difference between them? Here's the muscles that go on a rhea. We can assume that the muscles that went on T-Rex are probably somewhere between a rhea and a crocodile, right? A lot of people use what's called external phylogenetic bracketing. So you are a dinosaur, right? Which means your cousins are, well, not your cousins are crocodiles, and your descendants are birds. So if there's some behavior or there's some muscle, there's something that both a crocodile and a bird has, there's a chance that you also had that trait. So Chris, right on the money, a lot of paleontologists use modern birds and how they move and how they fly and their musculature to understand dinosaurs. And that's relatedly, that's why I use physical models, because all the taxa that I work on don't have any modern descendants. The last of them went extinct 120 million years ago. So I can't grab anything like, yes, this is the guy I can use to model my stuff. I use the bones in modeling.
Is that the next research direction, to pursue where you have a little bit more rich data, or you want to stick with the tough samples?
Oh, the tough samples. They're just, oh man, they're so
Can
great.
we call them that? Is that a fair label?
You know what? Fair. They're just misunderstood. And that's why I'm here to understand them.
All right, so we just have a few more minutes left with you, Asia. And I really, as I started off the top of the hour explaining, part of the reason I'm so excited by you as a scientist and by your work is I really think in some ways your research sort of marries like your own story, right? We've talked a little bit about how our personal journeys through science have taken us in a certain direction, or maybe informed a certain direction. Do you find it important to sort of speak to your personal story into your science?
Yeah. a big part of the way that I try to do science is to make it accessible. I'm from Philadelphia. I was born at Temple, right? I have been able to see Penn almost every day that I've been alive, right? But being close doesn't mean access, right? And the forefathers of my field definitely didn't want to give someone that looked like me access, right? So making sure that anyone who wants to do science can do science is really important to me in the way that I try to distribute my work and the techniques that I develop. So some of the methods that I use are on freeware. So anyone that could pick up my paper, right, could also go grab their specimens and do it. I've been very fortunate that I've worked in well-funded places. I got to go to an Ivy League for my PhD, right? Not everyone has that, but everyone should be able to answer their own questions.
I really love that. Everyone should be able to answer their own questions. I feel like we need to get that in a plaque on the wall. That's great. And you know, to sort of round that off there, I mean, you spoke to it so succinctly, and again, a really, really beautiful sum up there. It sort of just maps onto this idea that, you know, the more diverse and inclusive we can make our STEM spaces, the more diverse and inclusive and accessible, we should even add, our science becomes, right? And so you talked about accessibility there, and that sort of speaks to this subfield within engineering of, and I might get the phrase wrong here, but diverse designs and social impact, right? I know that's something a little bit that your lab does, but can you sort of define that phrasing for us about like how we can use diverse designs to have social impact?
Yeah, so it's just about getting more, like you just said, getting more diverse people in the room, right? Designing, I'm just very passionate about it, so I take a deep breath.
Sure.
So like I said earlier, technology and robots are coming into our lives in a way that's going to fundamentally change the way that we live, right? Think about when cell phones happened, right? And now we're having AIs and physical robots out in the world, right? And the world is not homogenous. It isn't, right? It's beautiful because it isn't homogenous, but a lot of the designers and engineers in these spaces are very close to homogenous, right? And it's not that they're inherently bad, but if they're homogenous, their ideas are all the same, right? And if we're going into a complicated world where ideas are not the same and needs are not the same, then how are we expected to our robots to work if our designers are homogenous, right? That's just bad logic. If you put all of the same person in the room, you're going to get the same system out for a world that is not the same.
Right. I love that. So, you know, we've studied Earth history together. We know that times change, right? We know that species change, humans change, and absolutely. And again, that's where we can see so naturally this fit of paleontology and robotics, though it seems so disparate. Again, a really beautiful marriage there. Asia, you really just summed everything up so beautifully there. I have absolutely nothing to add. Where can we go to learn either about your research or the GRASP lab? Are there any links that we can share out with our audience if they want to learn more?
So I know that GRASP has an updated website where you can do tours and see. I know the COD lab, my lab, has pictures of all of our robots, so you can see my two favorites, Kanan and Inu. And yeah, I think those are the two best places to go.
Fabulous. So we'll monitor those pages for folks watching at home. We can drop those links into the chat, and we'll keep an eye out for all of your work forthcoming. I think that'll do it for us today. Thanks everyone for joining our special robotics edition of Franklin Outside. We've had Dr. Asia Carter on today. Thanks again, Asia. It's been a real pleasure hearing from you today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was awesome to chat.
Fabulous. All right, everybody. We will see you next time on Franklin Outside. Have a great afternoon.